Good morning. I'm so glad so many of you could join us on Zoom for the St. Louis Regional Chamber's Public Policy Speaker Series on Equity and Economic Justice. I'm Austin Walker, Vice President of Public Policy at the St. Louis Regional Chamber. As you're all aware, there's been a national outcry for justice following the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor. St. Louis Regional Chamber stands as an ally to those who speak to make positive changes in our community and are taking a deep look within the chamber to weave equity into all of our initiatives. Today, I'm glad that we have 5 tremendous elected officials who will discuss our region's current situation as we listen and develop actionable solutions that'll help bridge the divide stifling our region and nation from moving forward. I would like to extend my thanks to Congressman Lacy, Missouri Senator Brian Williams, Illinois Representative LaToya Greenwood, St. Louis Board of Alderman President Louis Green, and St. Louis County Councilwoman Rochelle Walton Gray for their continued support of the region and for taking time to join our virtual meeting this morning. Thank you to everyone on the call. If you have a question that you'd like answered by any of our speakers, please use the chat in Zoom and we'll do our best to get to your questions. Closed captioning is also provided during these briefings, so please feel free to use that feature as well. Before we get started, I'd like to take this time to thank St. Louis Regional Chamber's 2020 public policy sponsors. Their contributions support all of our policy programming throughout the year. I also want to take the time to address the Regional Chamber's response to the most recent instances of African Americans being murdered by police. If you've not read it, you can find the full statement in the St. Louis American, but I've pulled a few quotes from the Chamber that I'll use to set the tone for our conversation. The Chamber noted that our nation is being traumatized by systemic racism. As leaders, we have the responsibility of acknowledging how far our country has gone to provide every person the freedom and opportunity to live with dignity and peace. Hatred, discrimination, and injustice are unacceptable and have no place in our society. With that, I'd like to introduce Congressman Lacy, representing Missouri's 1st Congressional District. Congressman Clay is serving his 10th term in office. In the 116th Congress, Congressman Clay is the chairman of the House Financial Service Committee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, and Congressman Clay is a member of the House Oversight and Reform Committee. Please welcome Congressman Lacy.
Thank you, Austin, and good morning, everyone. I want to thank the Regional Chamber for convening us, and I'm pleased to be back with you. In the past, I would have offered you an upbeat assessment of the business climate and what we can do as a region to expand jobs and opportunity, but these are not normal times. So let me offer you 3 key updates that are most relevant to the challenges we are facing. First, for the small business community, I'm pleased to report that the Congress has passed and the President has signed into law an extension of the forgiveness period under the Paycheck Protection Program. We have extended the forgivable loan schedule from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. And in talking to small business people since we passed PPP, extending that forgivable window was the key to making the federal help work for them. And that's especially true for local restaurants who told me that they could never recover in 8 weeks after reopening. But they could get back on their feet in 6 months. So we listened, and the program is much better now. Second, I want to talk a little about the HEROES Act, which I was proud to co-sponsor and help pass in the U.S. House. Like many good ideas for the country, the HEROES Act is sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk, waiting for him to finally do his job and schedule a vote in the U.S. Senate. This bill is critical to the future of the business community because without the emergency federal help for states, counties, and local municipalities included in the HEROES Act, many of them will have to make drastic cutbacks in vital public services. Less public safety, less public works, and less services in general, and that's bad for business. And it would take a huge toll in our community. I helped put $16.4 billion into the pipeline to help Missouri. But we won't get a dime unless the Senate votes on the bill. So I would encourage you to reach out to our U.S. senators and urge them to ask Leader McConnell to schedule a vote now and then vote yes without delay. Finally, all of you know what the country has been going through over the last 2 weeks after the police murder of George Floyd. Many of you know that I have helped author and introduce the Justice in Policing Act of 2020, which the House will vote on later this month. This is the most sweeping police reform bill ever attempted at the federal level, and it contains 3 of my top legislative proposals that I've been actively pursuing since the Ferguson uprising in 2014, including making the use of deadly force the last resort for law enforcement, mandating an independent prosecutor in all instances of police killings, and requiring all new and existing police officers to undergo transformative training to address racial bias, cultural awareness, de-escalation tactics, and the pervasive use of excessive force with non-white subjects. And you know, it may take generations to achieve racial equality in this nation, but our bill is a powerful, bold step forward to move American society to a new normal for both race relations and policing. Some of the highlights of the Justice in Policing Act include holding police officers accountable in the courts by reforming qualified immunity, improving police training and practices by ending racial and religious profiling, banning no-knock warrants in drug cases, banning chokeholds and carotid holds, and changing the standard to evaluate whether law enforcement use of force was justified from whether the force was reasonable to whether the force was necessary, and requiring federal uniformed police officers to wear body cameras. And our bill finally makes lynching a federal crime. This legislation is urgent, and I'm going to do all I can to see that it becomes law. That's more than enough from me, and I thank you for your time today.
Congressman, thank you very much. We really appreciate that. And you mentioned your top 3 priorities for police reform, that are included in the bill. What do you think the impact of this bill would be on the St. Louis region specifically?
Well, I think it would hold police forces accountable to the public, and the way you have to do that, for instance, what we did in Ferguson was demand a patterns and practices investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice, and out of that investigation came a consent decree that is now overseen by federal judge Gene Hamilton, has been implemented. You have seen the police force transform. You've seen the city government transform, where they no longer treat black motorists as ATM machines. And it all culminated last week in the election of Ella Jones to be this first African-American mayor. So those are the kind of systemic changes we need to make in St. Louis and around the country to hold police officers accountable so that we never witness again what we saw happen in Minneapolis right before the world, the death of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer.
Now, Congressman, your colleagues in the Senate have essentially said that this bill will likely not go anywhere, with Senator Blunt saying this week, I don't think you can come up with a national enforceable response on conduct or practice, nor do I think you can come up with a national manual that really makes sense for departments. So the question to you, Congressman, is what compromises are there in order to make this bill perhaps more palatable to Senate Republicans and your House colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are less inclined to act? And have you brought them to the table at all?
Well, here's what I do know. In the Senate, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina is leading the Republican effort to come up with legislation. And in the legislative process, every piece of legislation is a starting point. And as we go through the process, I'm confident that my Republican colleagues in the House, as well as my Republican, as well as Republican members of the Senate, will look at these proposals and make a conscious decision in the end to support them. So I feel confident that we will get Republican support in the House as well as the Senate to get this legislation to the president's desk. As far as what we can compromise on, I'm not sure, Austin, because I feel as though these are reforms that are being proposed that are needed. And as I said in the press conference on Monday, it's time for those elected leaders, whether they're local, state, or federal, to listen to the American people. And they have spoken loud and clear by the millions, through their feet, by marching, and through their protests, by voicing their total outrage and opposition to the way African Americans are treated in this nation, have been treated for centuries by law enforcement. And I've heard personally from my Republican colleagues who felt who want to know, what can we do? We feel helpless, but we want to help, and we want to be part of changing this climate. And so I feel optimistic about the chances for this bill.
Thank you, Congressman. And, you know, the last question, we're having a lot of really deep conversations at the regional chamber with our team, with our members about race. And, you know, as we all know, the historic roots of racism run deep in our nation and this region, of course. And, you know, given the over 180-year lifespan of the chamber, you know, our organization is undoubtedly a part of that history. So, you know, we're trying to, you know, put that all in perspective and move forward and do better. What can the business community do to help curb economic and racial inequity? And what organizations or initiatives would you encourage us to support?
Now, here's what I would suggest. And I've talked to small, medium, and large business CEOs, and I've urged them to do an evaluation of your history and relationship with the African American community, with the potential hires who happen to be African American. Did you hire them? Did you disqualify them for whatever reason? Or even once you hired them, did you promote them in a fair and just way? Did you pay them similarly? Because all of these factors, and did you elevate them to mid or top level management? And if you didn't, did you help them get the necessary training they needed? Because you have to understand, that is part of the African American experience, and it is something that I think each business person has to do some introspection and realize, have you contributed to the uplift of the African American community or to the demise of it? And that's where things have to change. And if the business community is not ready to do that, then things will not change in the St. Louis community. So my message is, do some self-evaluation and determine, how could I do this better? How could I have a better relationship with this community? And understand, we as African Americans, we want to be treated the same as you would want to be treated, with some respect and dignity, and recognize our humanity. So
Congressman, well said. We really appreciate that. Take your words to heart, and really appreciate you being part of the conversation with us today and joining the call with our members. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Austin.
Absolutely. Now joining us is Representative LaToya Greenwood. In office since January 2017, Representative Greenwood represents Illinois' 114th district, which encompasses East St. Louis, Scott Air Force Base, and parts of O'Fallon. A lifelong resident of East St. Louis, Representative Greenwood previously served as a city councilwoman. Please welcome Representative LaToya Greenwood.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Austin and the Chamber, for hosting this conversation this morning. And I'm honored to be on a panel with Congressman Clay also, so thank you.
Thank you for being here. So there have been some in the Illinois General Assembly that have proposed policing reforms for the legislature to take up. What reforms do you think are necessary?
So I do believe that we need to do a statewide response to hold police accountable for excessive use of force and to address institutional racism that has devastated many Black communities, like the several of the communities that I represent, including East St. Louis, Centerville, Washington Park, and Allerton. And we need to have a statewide system where bad police officers are held accountable for the deaths of our Black men and women in Illinois and across the country. And so we can't have, for instance, police officers that are fired from one department for questionable or bad policing and then bounce to another department. We have to hold them accountable, and at the same time, we have to, again, address these issues of poverty, too, in communities.
Absolutely. And so, Representative, do you think there's a sense of urgency behind some of these policing reforms? Will the Illinois General Assembly address some of these issues during the fall veto session, do you think?
I do believe so. I do believe we will be addressing those issues. I know the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, we're working on putting an agenda together for our upcoming veto session, and police reform will be included in that. But not just police reform, you know, we want to talk about access and inclusion as well, to create equity and economic justice for Black people.
Absolutely. Representative, could you maybe expand on some of the issues with access and inclusion, you know, as we, you know, develop our, you know, legislative priorities going into these sessions?
So to address poverty and racism in Illinois and around the country is to open accessibility. And so for me, that means access to higher education. It means access to job training, access to quality health care. When we look at healthcare in communities like that I represent, when hospitals close, they are normally closed in Black communities, the communities where we need services the most. And so some of the things that we should be looking at as possible solutions is that in Illinois, we have the Rebuild Illinois Capital Plan. And within that plan, there needs to be a commitment to high-paying jobs and jobs that can support families and be made available to Black people to address this issue of poverty by inclusion. And we need to be a part of those capital projects all over the state. And also with the releasing of federal funds that the state received, a portion of that money should be focused on communities of color that have long been suffering, and it has been made worse by the pandemic and civil unrest. So there's numerous issues that need to be addressed when we start to talk about institutional racism and how we can get to equity and economic justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the chamber wants to partner with you on many of those initiatives. And, you know, this brings me to my next question, the same question I asked Congressman Clay. You know, what can the business community do to help curb economic and racial inequity? And what organizations or initiatives would you encourage the business community to support in Southwest Illinois?
Well, again, I think Congressman Clay summed it up pretty well. It's about, for me, inclusion. The doors need to be open, and we need to know as Black people that we will be able to have access to jobs and training that will be able to take care of our families. Many times there's a lot of barriers that are created, and that includes the unions being inclusive and what they're doing and how they're hiring laborers and things like that. We have plenty of businesses throughout the state of Illinois that should be able to provide opportunities for all people, not just some.
And last question, Representative. You know, I actually came on board to the chamber during the summer that person happened. And, you know, it seemed that we went through a lot of, you know, conversation. There was some healing, some reform. Obviously, nothing changed the status quo, right? The situation keeps happening, and there are protesters all over the world now. What's your feeling? Do you think this time is different? Do you think we're ready to address some of these systemic issues?
Oh, I do believe so. 8 minutes and 46 seconds have changed all of our lives, and our lives will never be the same. These, again, are not normal times, and no, I do not believe that we should go back to things as they were in the past. This is about creating opportunities. This is about removing barriers. This is about conversations that need to be had in terms of race and how we can move forward together.
Representative, that couldn't have been stated better. Really appreciate you and you being here and joining the conversation. And, you know, please consider us always, you know, as partners into the future on these issues. We're on this together, and we can't go back. So thank you for being here with our members.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now joining us is the president of the St. Louis Board of Aldermen, Louis Reed. Serving since 2007, President Reed was the first African-American elected to be the president of the Board of Aldermen in the history of the board. Prior to his role as president of the Board of Aldermen, President Reed served as the city's 6th Ward Alderman. Please welcome President Louis Reed. President, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much for having me. You know, and I also want to just thank the Regional Chamber for having these discussions. I think they're very timely. And, you know, we have a opportunity for some major change, not just in St. Louis, but across the nation. As, you know, the Congressman and the Representative just spoke to, we have to seize on that opportunity and introduce legislation and pass bills that during normal times, it would be all but impossible to line up the votes to get them done. So, so thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, President Reed, you marched with the nonprofit group 100 Black Men of Metropolitan St. Louis this week and spoke with protesters on the steps of City Hall. Can you tell us what that experience was like, and you know what kinds of changes people are asking for in our community?
You know, I did, and it was just rewarding for me to be amongst the, you know, the Collegiate 100, which is a bunch of young African-American men that are working to change this nation and working for fairness and equity in the workplace and, you know, in the courts also. They marched from the courthouse to City Hall and then went inside City Hall for a meeting with the mayor. Because they understand that to change a system, you have to show up, you have to vote, and you have to assure that your message is being heard by leadership. And that's what they were doing that day. And it was, again, as a father of four, for me, it was just rewarding to have an opportunity to walk with them and to support their efforts.
Mr. President, we're talking about a number of changes. They're being proposed at the federal and the state level. Are there any police changes to policing that are being considered by the Board of Aldermen in the city?
Yes, right now we have Board Bill 63, which is a placeholder bill. And some of the legislators that are on the call today will understand what that means. A placeholder bill you normally put in place when you're running out of time close to the end of session. We have a few weeks left at the board. So to get a bill in and before the board, you have to introduce it maybe earlier than it's ready. So we introduced a placeholder bill to address the use of force. And that will be introduced and first read at the Board of Aldermen this Friday, and go to committee next week, where we will introduce a committee substitute that further expands on the bill. The bill does four things as it currently stands: it bans chokeholds and strangleholds, it requires de-escalation tactics to be used, and it creates a duty to intervene policy, right? Which is absolutely important for the police department, because if you witness something happening in the field, you should have a duty to report that incident, right? And have that incident documented. It also requires a reporting for any time a weapon is drawn in the field, right? And it adds some transparency and accountability to the police department. And here's why that's important. Policies, if you have a policy on the books, a policy can change at whim depending on what the current chief would like to see, a public safety director, mayor, or whatever, right? They can change a policy at will, which is why sometimes bills like this, Bill 63, some of those bills are very difficult to get passed during a normal times when you don't have protests and things of that nature, because there are a million reasons people can give not to support creating a law with some penalties attached and consequences attached to it. This gives us an opportunity to pass something along to transform our police department. The other thing I'd add to that is no matter whether we have one police officer or 100,000 police officers, right? We have to have a system in place of checks and balances, a system that helps to create a just and fair system for all who come in contact with it. And that's what this bill begins to do. We're going to have others that follow it, but this one will be greatly expanded as it moves forward.
It sounds like there's some pretty significant provisions there in Board Bill 63. What do you think the chances are of this passing?
In a normal session, without mass protests across the country and without a mass awareness like we see now, it would stand absolutely no chance of passing. But with the mass protests and with the mass things that are happening around the country right now, it stands a very good chance of passing, and I expect it to pass. And I'd say this to legislators: when you have these times where you have mass community upheaval across the country or within your city, those are the times where you can actually get some of these major pieces of legislation passed. When Mike Brown was shot and killed, we were able to get a civilian oversight bill passed that had been back and forth before the Board of Aldermen since the early 90s, but we were never able to muster the votes for it. But with the shooting of Mike Brown and the mass protests that happened across our region and across the country, we were finally able to get the votes to get that bill passed. The same thing with minority inclusion. When the Stockley shooting happened, we were able to get those things passed that we were not able to muster the votes for before. And so it's at times like this that you absolutely must do everything that may have been sitting on the shelf, or some of those ordinances and things that have been lingering out there. Put them back together and put them back before the people who have to vote on it, and hold them accountable.
Thank you, sir. This next question comes from our friends at the United Way and our good member Ed Bryant here. Can President Reed provide his perspective on the recently introduced 5-point plan that includes defunding the SLPD, closing the workhouse, targeting city funds to underserved areas in the city, et cetera?
I understand why each one of those proposals were made. Absolutely understand why they were made. But each one of those programs, each one of the things that that people are asking for me as the head of the legislative branches of city government, I have to focus on those things that will bring some long-term sustainable change, and those things that in a normal circumstance would be very difficult to move, right? So if you, for example, if you look at defunding the police, you can defund the police or dismantle the police department. But at the end of it, what will you need? You will need to ensure that you have not policies, but laws in place that assure that whether you have one police officer or 100,000 police officers, the things are in place that govern the direction of that department, that assures accountability and transparency to that department, that assures that the oath that they take to protect and to serve is administered in a fair and equitable. And so to do that, you need ordinances in place to do that, right? I don't think that you just leave it up to policies. So every ounce of energy I have will be focused on assuring that we have the ordinances in place, that no matter what system no matter who's leading, no matter who's hired, no matter who wears the blue or the white uniform, that the laws are in place to begin to change the course and direction of that department for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, sir. And last question, and this hits on the same theme that we're kind of getting at. What can business organizations, like the Chamber, our friends at Civic Progress, RBC, and our members, what can we do to help curb economic, racial inequity in the city?
I think one of the things that the region, that the Chamber can do, and the business community can do, they can help us move to more of a regional policing model. When we look at the things that we're doing here in the city of St. Louis, like even once we do a complete gut rehab and overhaul of our police training, right? That will just be for the city of St. Louis, right? We will then have to hope that the county follows suit, or if the county moves forward first, then the city, hopefully the city will move second, right? There's some real advantages to having a regional policing model and a regional policing strategy in place, which, when you look at what we're up against today, you look at the racial injustices that happen over and over again across this country, and there are counties across this nation that are as large or larger than St. Louis City and St. Louis County put together. So certainly we need regional policing strategy and a regional policing model in place with all the reforms that we can put together to assure that in the foreseeable future, we have a police department, like I said earlier, that when you take that oath to protect and to serve, it means that you're going to protect and to serve in a fair, equitable, and just manner.
Mr. President, thank you very much. We really appreciate that update and really appreciate your insights and for you being here with our members today. Thanks for being here, sir.
All right, thank you for having me.
All right. Next joining us is Missouri Senator Brian Williams. Senator Williams represents the Missouri's 14th senatorial district in St. Louis County. Elected in 2018, Senator Williams is the youngest member in the Missouri Senate. In the 100th General Assembly, Senator Williams serves on the Appropriations Committee, Government Reform Committee, and the Small Business and Industry Committee. Please welcome Senator Brian Williams. Senator, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Austin, and thank you for having me on. I want to say really quick, good morning to not only the members of the Regional Chamber, but also any colleagues and first-time visitors. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think the panel has made some really great points, just really touching around the challenges that have impacted our region and our country. As the only Black male state senator in Missouri, I know firsthand the challenges of being Black in America. Racism, police brutality, systemic injustices, the fear of losing my life due to the color of my skin remains a reality for me as well as people like me. This is exactly why we must proclaim Black Lives Matter. Civil unrest is the natural result of a society that ignores systemic racism and discrimination. On the right side of history because they're bringing much needed attention to unacceptable disparities between communities of color and everyone else. That lies with disparities, whether it's treatment by law enforcement officers, the quality of our schools, access to healthcare, employment and income, etc. We must not allow also pundits and people with partisan agendas to get away with amplifying the looting and criminals who only want to distract from the real message. We must keep people focused. And the focal point of this conversation and where we are in the nation is Black Lives Matter. Our society, through its laws and leaders, should address these disparities as such. They should work towards actionable solutions, which includes treatment by law enforcement officers. As we all know, there's been years of research that has concluded that there are 8 policies associated with lowering the rate of police-involved killings. One of those are requiring officers to de-escalate situations when possible before using force, use of force or continuum or matrix that defines the limit, types of force and specific weapons that can be used to respond to particular levels of resistance. We must restrict chokeholds and strangleholds, including situations where deadly force is authorized or prohibiting them altogether. Require officers to give a verbal warning when possible before using deadly force. Prohibit officers from shooting at people in moving vehicles unless the person poses a deadly threat by means other than the vehicle. For example, shooting at people from the vehicle should not be acceptable in our country or our state. Require officers to exhaust all other reasonable alternatives before resorting to using deadly force. Require officers to intervene to stop another officer from using excessive force. As we saw in Minneapolis, there was an opportunity for the 3 other officers who are now being charged with second-degree murder to have intervened, and I'm convinced had they intervened, they would have saved Mr. George Floyd's life. We must also require officers to report both uses of force and threats attempted uses of force. For example, reporting instances where an officer intentionally points a firearm at a civilian. I believe these are policies that are associated with the largest reductions in police-involved killings per population, where policies require that comprehensive reporting, which has led to a 25% reduction, require officers to exhaust all other reasonable means before shooting, which has also resulted in a reduction, and ban chokeholds and strangleholds, which also has led to roughly a 22% reduction in communities and populations that have these policies in place. Departments with 4 or more restrictive use of force policies in place had 37% fewer police-involved killings per population than those that had 0 or 1 of these policies in place. These policies are also good for police. They improve the safety of the officers as well. Departments with more restrictions when it comes to use of force have fewer police killed in the line of duty. Departments with more restrictive use of force have policies that result in fewer assaults on officers. I'm going to stop there, but when I think about the district that I represent, and this has been a conversation I've had with the regional chamber, as well as many folks throughout the entire state of Missouri, is that I represent a district that has some of the wealthiest communities in the state, such as Clayton and Ladue, and I also represent some of the more poverty-stricken ones, such as Ferguson, Berkeley, Kinloch. And it requires me to operate and work within an unprecedented scope when it comes to policies, but also working very close with the business community to find solutions. My district includes several small businesses, larger corporations like Boeing, Emerson, Centene, downtown Clayton, University of Missouri, St. Louis, Washington University, Lambert Airport. Those entities, as well as some of the challenges that have impacted our community, our region, our state, and our country, have to coexist. And I'm grateful that we're having this conversation to be able to find solutions and work together to ensure that we have a stronger region.
Senator, thank you for that. And I'll say, as the leader of our public policy team at the chamber, I get a lot of questions about our position on issues and our stance on important world events. And I want to start off the conversation by acknowledging, a few things that we can take as fact. And the historic roots of racism run deep and are real in our nation and our region. Police brutality against African Americans is well evidenced. So is white supremacy. And yes, Black Lives Matter. Period. Senator, many of the protests have been in your district, and you've been out in your community joining with protesters. What's been the key takeaway from the protests in your district, and what changes are folks asking for?
Well, I mean, one, we have to be clear that when we have protests, one, the protests that have been in my district have been peaceful ones, but we have also had some challenges. One of the biggest challenges that I was concerned with is in Ferguson, where I represent, that were some damaged businesses, small businesses, restaurants that I frequent quite often, restaurant owners that have become friends of mine in the community. And what we notice is that there has been this influx of people from outside of the community that are coming and using these peaceful protests as opportunities, looting, whether it's starting fires. I've been in conversations with the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Missouri in regards to folks that they've been able to identify that have been either linked to various groups that may promote sentiments of white supremacy. There's also been groups that have been involved in creating chaos during the peaceful protests that have a history of criminal violence and criminal history of committing crimes in the past. So we have to make sure that we create safeguards to ensure that our peaceful protesters are safe first, because we have so many different people from the community and the region that are out there, including children. But we also have to make sure that we work together to identify those bad actors who are looking to create a message that really takes us away from what this issue is about. In terms of just participating in a protest and talking to people, I also urge folks to not lose sight of the fact that we are in the middle of a global pandemic. We still have to figure out how to peacefully protest, but maintain some level of social distancing, and still keep in mind that we have to take the proper steps to ensure that we do not contribute to the spread of COVID-19. it was a question that was asked earlier, Austin, that kind of lies within the scope of the question you just asked. The response to the protests, I was in Springfield, Missouri this past weekend, and I spoke at a rally that had roughly 2,000 people in Springfield, Missouri. And when I tell you the energy and just the hope that I saw among the population of people there that really want change and that really want to see our country move forward as one, was very exciting and something that was extremely heartwarming for myself. So I think that we're moving in the right direction. I think that the protests have led to some groundbreaking opportunities, representing Ferguson and also working with Congressman Clay prior to serving as a senator in this state during the time of the Ferguson unrest. So I remember working very closely with him around ensuring that the United States Justice Department implemented a consent decree for the city of Ferguson, which have led to a Black police chief in Ferguson, has led to now recently elected mayor in Ferguson. And it also has led to a Black St. Louis County prosecutor. And I'm hoping that, you know, those steps continue to allow us to not only govern, but continue to interact and build our community up as one.
Senator, speaking of the direction, there have been a number of rumblings, you know, that we've been hearing that the General Assembly might take up some police reform measures next session. So, you know, the question is, one, is that something you plan on taking up? And, you know, what specifically would you like to see the legislature tackle? What kinds of reforms will make the most impact?
Well, I think one, Austin, it's not only just addressing it this session, but it's making it something that becomes the keystone to what we do in the legislature, and that's pass laws and policies that are inclusive to every Missourian in this state. And being the first Black male senator in the Missouri Senate in roughly 20 years, this is the first time it's been a conversation from the perspective of a Black male. And when I tell you the relationships that I've been able to build and create and give my colleagues insight on what those challenges are, not just in St. Louis, but throughout the entire state of Missouri, and understand that this is not an issue that solely lies on challenges within the urban community, but these are things that can happen in any community throughout Missouri if we don't pay close attention to it. In terms of where the legislature goes, moving forward, I would say it's probably a moving target. I don't know exactly where we will go, but in the Missouri Senate, and one of my colleagues was on the call, I don't know if she's still on there or not, Senator Carla May, I'm confident that we'll all work together to ensure that this is a conversation. I think in the Senate, we have a very committed body where we've been able to work through tough and challenging issues. And this will be something that would be at the top of my priority list. My office right now is currently working on addressing Missouri statute when it comes to how police officers use excessive force, how we define excessive force in the state of Missouri, and ensuring that there are accountability measures in place to set some type of precedent if that excessive force was used by someone within government, in particular law enforcement.
Well, Senator, I want to thank you. You got to get to Councilwoman Gray, but I want to, take the time to say, we really appreciate your work, this year, last year in the General Assembly. Really appreciate your voice in the Senate, and we're proud that you're from St. Louis. And, as you know, consider us as partners into the future. We're here to help, and thank you for your service.
No, absolutely, Austin. And if anyone on the call or any of your members have ideas or some solutions or things they've seen within their own space or outside of our state, please feel free to reach out to myself as well as my office. We're receptive to ideas, and I hope everyone remembers that we're in this together.
Thank you, Senator. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now joining us is St. Louis County Councilwoman Rochelle Walton Gray, representing North St. Louis County, including Blackjack, Spanish Lake, Bellefontaine Neighbors, Riverview, and a small area of Florissant. Councilwoman Gray has served since 2017. Prior to joining the St. Louis County Council, Councilwoman Gray served 8 years in the Missouri House of Representatives. Please welcome the Honorable Councilwoman Rochelle Walton Gray. Councilwoman, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm sorry. Thank you for having me this morning. I appreciate being on the call. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. As a local legislator or a local elected official, I do have a bird's eye view of what's been going on recently, and also my stint in the legislature gave me a insight on what was going on at the time across this state, but more specifically across the city and county with regards to the Ferguson arrest. But prior to that, my family has been very involved in the movement to increase action, with regards to racism and to do away with racism. So I'm very happy to be on this call this morning.
Well, we appreciate you being here with us. Councilwoman, you're the chair of the Justice, Health, and Welfare Committee. What, if any, proposals will your committee consider as a result of the recent civil unrest and other police incidents?
Well, unfortunately, due to our charter in St. Louis County, we cannot implement policy with regards to policing practices. We can draft resolutions to request and strongly request changes through the Police Commission Board. So it is the contention that our police board is the one who handles or deals with policing practices. I tend to disagree, but I'm a lone person. I think that we should be able to legislate. We represent the community, and we should be able to legislate, not supervise the police department. But at this point, that has to be determined. So we did implement a resolution a couple of years ago that requested additional training in the areas of racial profiling, sensitivity training, cultural competency, and deadly force, those such things, de-escalation. That was implemented a couple of years ago. We also budgeted $1 million through Prop P funds for this additional training. However, for some reason, unknown to me, and I've asked the question several times, only $250,000 of that $1 million, which was, by the way, requested by the police department. They requested $1 million for additional training and did only use $250,000. And that was primarily just to hire, that funds was primarily only used to hire, I think, 2 persons, one to teach constitutional law, and I can't remember what the other was for. So I am disillusioned and not happy about that. One thing we hear consistently from our police department, including our former chief and current chief, is that we have training. Obviously, the training that they have is not adequate because things like what we continue to see wouldn't happen. So therefore, in those areas, should I say, we're continually told that they are trained in those areas, which they are. But again, it is not adequate. It is sometimes a module. It is sometimes virtual learning and not in classroom participation. Someone said if you need a class to know that some of the things that we've seen more recently, but some things that have been going on for 100 years. If you need a class to be told that those things are wrong, or that it's a problem, or that it is a result of racism, then you probably shouldn't be where you are. You should not become a police officer or anything, or be anything that is in relation to dealing with people, such as the medical field, if you don't think that the things that we've seen even more recently, is something wrong with that. So that's the gist of what we've tried to do in the county, and we will be, like it was mentioned earlier, this is a good time to look into doing more things, such as a board that reviews officer-involved deaths. One thing that I think is another issue is that police officers, they go from municipality to municipality. They have an issue in one municipality, and then they are able to transfer or quit and move on to another, because there's no record of what happened in the previous job that they had, and meaning they may have been suspended, or there was a chance that they were getting ready to be suspended, or some type of negative action was taken, so they quit before it came down, and then they moved on to another police department. So that's something that needs to be addressed as well. And I want to stop because I can go on, and I know I'm limited on time, because you may have a question that you want me to answer.
Sure. Councilwoman, President Reed mentioned this earlier. Do you think it's a good idea for the county to coordinate with President Reed and the Board of Aldermen to develop regional reforms to our police department?
Of course, that would be a good idea. And I guess actually for the reason that I just stated, some police officers don't stay in one jurisdiction for their entire career. I would venture to say, and I don't have the statistics on that. So a regional approach would be great. And of course, we would be glad to work with the city aldermen to come up with some type of regional plan.
Councilwoman, next question comes from the chat from Sinette Magnus with Lewis Rice. Does the Councilwoman have any comments on the role the county executive plays in need of police reforms?
Well, that is a misconception. Again, we are a county and not a city. So we do not directly affect our departments, hiring, firing, things like that. But he does have a significant role in that he can, again, strongly suggest, make requests of the police commission of things he would like to see in place, and of our chief. I think he plays a significant role, and he, I believe, has relayed to our police commissioners and our police department his ideas and ideologies, and what he thinks should be done with regards to what has happened these last few weeks or months and years. But yeah, he has a significant role, but he cannot require anything. He does not control the police commission board or the police department. Unfortunately, he's in this pretty much the same position that we are, but he has a much more significant role because of the nature of his job.
Sure. And Councilwoman, I want to end with the same question that we've kind of touched on with all of our guests today. What can the business community do to help curb economic and racial inequities in our region? And what would you encourage the business community to do, or who to reach out to gain better understanding and support?
Yes. One thing I wanted to touch on is, coming from the local government and county and what's going on with COVID-19, We have definitely, and the area has definitely seen how disproportionately the African American areas have been affected by COVID-19, disadvantaged areas in South County as well, but primarily our North County residents have seen a significant effect on this disease on our area. And that leads to or lends to our knowledge of the fact that racism, and I'm taking a quote from someone else, is a public health issue. So therefore, that brings me to what you're saying is that we need to do more to help these areas. And one of those things would be our Black businesses, and what can be done through various organizations is provide information and education to these Black businesses, mentorships, apprenticeships, internships, training in certain areas. The legislator from Illinois mentioned unions can get involved in a more significant way. They have tried to start moving towards inclusion, but again, there's a long way to go. We have a long way to go. And but apprenticeships and internships and training, education, those things are very important. And anytime we can provide these things at a low cost or no cost is even better, because a lot of people just cannot afford to go to a 2-year or 4-year college. So with all that said, opportunity is the key to building bridges and just being open to your fellow man, the person who's walking by you, next to you, behind you. Be cognizant that they are probably no different than who you are. So take them under your wing if you see someone who has a business similar to yours, and be a mentor to that person.
Councilwoman, I can't imagine a better note to end this program on. That is fantastic advice. And we really appreciate you making the time to have the conversation here today, with your colleagues and with our members. Thanks for everything that you do.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Take care. And thank everybody for joining today's Public Policy Speaker Series on equity and economic justice. Now, the St. Louis Regional Chamber maintains our commitment to building a prosperous region that works for all businesses and all people. The Regional Chamber will work to tackle our region's equity issues and continue to strengthen our efforts in public policy to champion issues that impact and foster an inclusive business community. Please join us for our Business Sustainability and Recovery series on reopening as a region. That Zoom meeting will be held immediately following our webinar this morning. Please see our website for more details. Thanks again for joining our virtual meeting today. This meeting is adjourned.